Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company where we are taking a look at a really extraordinarily cool piece of firearms history. This is, if I read it right off the receiver here, a Garand Autoloading Rifle. This is a model of 1924 Garand rifle, and it's one of the very first effective functional predecessors of what would be adopted as the M1 rifle, the famous M1 Garand by the United States military just before World War II. Now, John Garand's first rifle was in 1920, and it was actually a rotating bolt gun, primer actuated and rotating bolt. He seriously revised it in 1921, almost immediately, into a rifle with a tilting locking block behind the bolt, but still primer actuated. Now, primer actuation is a really unusual system. It's virtually never used, but it's a system that Garand tried in this rifle, and it had some real potential. The idea is, in a primer actuated rifle, when you fire, the pressure in the cartridge actually pushes the primer backwards out of the pocket in the cartridge case. If you think about it, you have the potential already, just in a regular cartridge, to already have a moving piston system, that being the primer. Now, today, we're used to the idea of, if the primer starts moving or gets flattened, that's a sign of dangerous pressure. But in Garand's design, there was actually basically a very small piston in the bolt face. And so the primer was able to move backwards and it would push this piston with it. That would unlock the system and then allow the bolt to cycle. So what you were doing is you were able to get a locked breech system without having anything on the barrel. So there's no gas port, the barrel's fixed, it doesn't have to reciprocate. Think about it as sort of as being a gas piston, but located in the back of the action instead of out on the barrel. Now there are downsides to the primer actuated system, and the biggest ones at the time were that it required ammunition where the primer was able to move, and this could be a problem. For example, on a belt-fed machine gun, where the ammunition's being rattled around pretty seriously by the firing sequence before it gets into the gun. Well, if you have a primer that starts to rattle its way back and loose, that's not going to work. That's going to cause a malfunction, and it's a problem. So we'll get to the implications of that. But suffice to say, in 1921, John Garand came up with this primer actuated system, and he spent a couple years really kind of fine-tuning it. And he had kind of like 1922, 23, and 24 patterns. And ultimately, he manufactured a small batch of 24 of these rifles. And this is the model of 1924. And this rifle would actually go into U.S. military testing. Now, at this point, most of the other competitors for the U.S. self-loading military rifle, most of the ones we're familiar with weren't around yet. So the main trials for this system weren't until like the late 20s or early 1930s. At this point, they were looking at the Bang rifle out of Denmark, the Hatcher Bang rifle, which was a Bang rifle, but then improved by James or Julian Hatcher, and there wasn't a whole lot else. There was the Thompson Autoloading Rifle, which is kind of a disaster. We have videos on 2 different Thompson autoloading rifles as well. So definitely, if you're interested in those, check them out. But that rifle is no way comparable to this one. This is far nicer as is. In fact, what's impressive is just how good of a gun this was in its current state. Anyway, I'm digressing. In 1924, this went into field trials, went into testing, endurance tests, reliability tests, and it came out looking really good. And then John Garand kind of got screwed. But before we talk about how John Garand got screwed and how this rifle completely went away, let's go ahead and take it apart. All right, before we actually take it apart, I kind of have a habit of doing this, don't I? I said we're going to take it apart, and then it's going to take a few minutes before we get there. But I want to point out a few things about the handling of this rifle, because it's something you can't necessarily get just through video. Basically, in a nutshell, this is a fantastic handling rifle. It feels great. The pistol grip is really well designed. The trigger is really nicely placed. You'll notice that when I'm pulling the trigger, I'm pulling my finger back towards my thumb. We don't have this issue of, a grip down here pushing the trigger up, or a straight grip where you're trying to pull the trigger back. You have this very natural motion, contracting the finger to pull the trigger. That seems like a really minor sort of thing, but it's important, it's relevant. The weight is good, the balance is good, this points nicely. You'll notice the rear sight here. This is a Winchester model of 1917 rifle rear sight, which is excellent for its time. It's got a nice big aperture back here. You can flip it up for long range fire, but most of the time you wouldn't need to. I really like this sight on the 1917 rifle, and it's a great sight for this rifle as well. As early as this was, a lot of people were still putting rear notch sights on combat rifles, and the aperture in this case is just a much better solution. The front sight here, and in fact the front hardware as well, is taken off of a 1903 Springfield. That's fine. It's a pretty nice, precise, narrow, square-topped front post. Nothing wrong with that. Doesn't have a sight hood. Doesn't really need one. I suppose you could put one on there to protect the front sight, but for the purposes of marksmanship and shooting, works just fine as is. It does have a bayonet lug, of course, as a combat rifle, or intended to be a combat rifle. That's an important element. At this point in the design, this rifle has a fixed 5-round internal magazine. So basically a Mauser pattern magazine in there. It does lock open when it's empty. We've got a stripper clip guide, and stuff your 5 rounds in and go to town. And I did find it interesting to note that as early as the early 1920s, Garand had already figured out the style of safety that he wanted. It's not identical in form to what would be on the M1 eventually, but it's exactly the same concept. So yeah, it's a sweet little rifle. It handles great, it points well, it's got great sights, it's got a good trigger. Everything about this rifle feels polished and professional. Even the disassembly method, as you'll see in a moment, is easy and smooth. It's not quite perfect, but compared to so many other prototype self-loading rifles of this period, you can really see the genius of John Garand, why this guy was a fantastic arms designer, and why his rifle would ultimately be so successful. So, without any further ado or further of me waxing on about how awesome this thing is, let's go ahead and take it apart. So to begin with, we have this bolt handle on the side. It has a locking peg that keeps it in this position, and when you push this lever in, it disables that locking peg, so now the bolt handle can move. Once we get to this point, now it's engaging on the bolt itself. It has to move back here because the rifle is currently cocked and ready to fire. If I dry fire it, now the bolt engages right there. So to open this up, we just pull the bolt handle back, and it will then, it's going to stay here until we release the bolt. This doesn't travel with the bolt when you fire, but it also doesn't go forward when the bolt's open because, well, you can't fire it anyway when the bolt's open. So in order to take this apart, we're going to start by removing the bolt handle. You take this spring-loaded tab, lift it up, and that allows you to pull the bolt handle back and disengage it from the bolt. So we'll come back to there, we'll lift it up one more time, and then the bolt handle comes back. So you can see the little locking button right there. That locks into this hole, this little detent hole in the receiver. And then at the front, you've got that catch right there, which locks over that little protrusion inside. So when I lift up the lever, that comes out. Next step is to take off the receiver cover. This rear section with the little knurled gripping surfaces, this lifts up, and then that whole piece comes back and just pops off. So there are two little rails. There's a rail section right there and one right there. That's what holds this top cover onto the receiver, and then this rear part just slides up and down, drops into place, and locks it in. Now we'll pull out the magazine floor plate just to get that out of the way. This is very Mauser-ish, so pushing the detent with your universal non-marring tool, and that's really simple. That's just a floor plate. Although, actually, I will point out, there's this threaded hole in the back, and there's some geometry on here that isn't being used for anything. I don't know what that was, but that was certainly some sort of feature that was removed at some point. Some sort of hold-open device, maybe. I'm not sure. Now, taking a look at what we've got, there is a recoil spring inside this tube. So I can compress it like that. This is normally going to impinge on the back. There's that little round hole for it right there. It's going to impinge on the back of the receiver cover when the gun cycles. that compresses. That's the recoil, the mainspring for this. And then we have the bolt body itself here. And then right here, we have the actual piston. So when you fire, the primer is going to push backwards, and it's going to push this piston, this internal piece, sleeve, you could say, it's going to push it backwards, which allows the gun to unlock. So in order to get this out, we have to basically do that. And this is the trickiest part. What you have to do is actually grab this and pull it backwards just a little bit. There we go. And as soon as you get the locking lug clear, then this is nice and free floating. So there's no spring on it because the spring's here and we've taken off the part that it impinges on. Now, and this is one of the amazing parts for me about how early of a rifle this is, to take the bolt out, just bring it to the back and boom. There's the whole bolt assembly, self-contained, comes right out of the gun. So on the breech face here, you can see the firing pin in the middle. It is fixed into that piston. And of course, you can see the piston as well. So the main diameter here is the outside of the cartridge case. And then we've got this inner diameter, which is the actual operating piston. We've got an extractor right here. This is spring-loaded, being pushed on by this flat metal spring, so it's going to go up and down. There is our ejector, which is a plunger ejector right there. And what happens when you push in on that center ring in the bolt face, this comes backward. And if you watch, here's our locking lug. When this comes back, let's see if I can get this. There we go. This internal sleeve, this piston, goes forward, and it pushes this locking lug down. Now, I'm going to leave it in this position to make sure I can get the gun back together. But what happens, we have a locking surface in the rifle right here. If I move that around, you can see it a little better. This is exactly the space needed for the bolt. The locking block drops downward and is held in position by this piston being physically in its way. So then the firing pin right here hits the primer. Primer fires, cartridge fires. The primer then starts to move backwards. That pushes this piston backwards, and it doesn't have to move very far. Just like an M1 carbine, once you give this thing a shove, it'll keep moving even after the primer has stopped. So once this moves far enough back, the locking lug is able to lift up out of the way, and then the whole bolt can cycle backward to extract the case and then load a new one. This little dealie, I believe, is what is locking the internal sleeve into the main bolt against pressure of this mainspring. So if you were going to detail strip this, you would have to push this internal sleeve forward right here and then rotate that out of its little lug there and take it apart. There's no way I'm taking it apart to that level of detail. To be honest, it was stressful enough taking it apart this far. All right, there are a couple more things that I want to show you. So I have taken the stock off, which was pretty standard, nothing really complex there. Here's our trigger system. This sear drops down to release this lug. I currently have the safety engaged, and that blocks the sear from dropping. If I push the safety forward, now the sear goes down. And by the way, if I push the safety a little farther forward, it just comes off. You can see the two detents there for safe and fire. One of the advantages of having the locking lug in the back is that it makes for a very clean and simple front end of the receiver. So there's nothing going on here. You don't need locking lugs, you don't need anything. And in theory, that makes the gun less susceptible to dirt coming in the front. This locking lug being underneath and inside is pretty well protected against stuff, dirt, mud, rain, etc. So that's the good. The bad is that a single locking lug back there is generally less strong. It's also not symmetrical, and it's probably going to lead to potential accuracy issues. I think this is the reason the FAL has never really been a successful marksman's rifle. That kind of locking system just doesn't really have the top potential accuracy that other systems do. By the way, the 2-lug front-mounted rotating bolt is fantastic for accuracy, but it leaves open a couple of locking lugs, which are easily filled with mud and dirt, something that the M1 Garand did have potential problems with, or did have real problems with in the field. I want to point out this thing right here, this separate piece of metal, which perhaps ought to have a couple of screws, but I'm not sure there. That is the locking surface itself. This is going to be made out of a different material than the rest of the receiver because it has substantially different hardness and toughness requirements. So you're going to make that out of a different alloy. You're going to make it replaceable so that if you have issues with headspace, you can take this out, replace it, and not have to scrap an entire rifle receiver. Perhaps the weirdest looking thing on the inside of this gun is this guy. Like, they crochet this gun together, or what is that? The answer is this is actually added after the fact to hold a pair of felt pads. You can see one right there and one right there. These are felt pads to oil the cartridges prior to firing. Now, some of you are, I can already hear you, you're saying, but wait, that was like half the point of the M1 Garand, especially when it got into competition with the Pedersen, is it didn't need lubricated cartridges. Well, the main competition for this rifle in the 1924 trials was the Thompson rifle, and the Thompson absolutely had to have lubricated cartridges. So part of the testing that they did was just out of a sense of scientific completeness, they added oil pads to some of the M1s as a control. So they figured, well, we'll do the reliability test with and without oiled cartridges, lubricated cartridges. And of course, the M1 did fine either way, and the Thompson Auto rifle did reasonably tolerably with lubricated cartridges and completely failed without them. So that's what this is. This wire is basically stitching a big felt pad inside this sheet metal case. I think the idea there is you can soak up a lot of oil in this pad, which means you only have to like fill it with oil once, and then you can shoot it for quite some time. Think of it like a Zippo lighter. You're only accessing the fluid from the top, but that big reservoir wicks up and can continue to be used for a long time. And one more element here that we should definitely take a look at. This is the stock. The upper handguard broke at some point in the last, almost 100 years. It used to be one piece, but it was very thin right at this band location, and long ago it snapped in half. And if we look at the inside of this stock, you know, I guarantee you, someone shot the bejesus out of this rifle. That wood looks like it's charcoal out of a campfire. I mean, this thing got really, really hot, and you can see it on the upper handguard as well on the inside there. To me, that is really cool. That, to me, is proof, well, evidence, perhaps if not absolute proof, that this is one of the rifles that was in serious testing, like this specific gun, because someone put enough ammo through this to get those handguards seriously smoking. This will probably make me sound like some hopelessly complete Garand fanboy, but you know what? It's kind of true. The M1 Garand rifle was an absolutely magnificent rifle for its time. There is good reason that it was the most successful of the early automatic, semi-automatic rifles, military rifles, and I think you can see the skills that Garand possessed in something even this early in 1924. It would be more than 10 years after this when he finally had a rifle actually adopted by the United States, but you can see the seeds of it in this. You can see the simple takedown, keeping parts into compact, self-contained units, the handling. So many rifles, you know, I've gotten to handle more early semi-auto rifles than most people at this point, and so many of them are just kludgy. They feel awkward, they're mechanically kludgy. You take them apart and you're like, oh geez, I don't know that I'd want to ever pull the trigger on this thing. You know, so much of this is just, it's gonna break, it's gonna fall apart, oh Lord, you're just nervous handling them. This thing just has signs of professionalism about it that you rarely see. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching. This was really kind of a revelation to me to get my hands on this and to learn just how really remarkably good Garand was even very early on in the development process for his rifle. So what's kind of historically funny here is that the thing that screwed John Garand on this was in some ways very similar to the thing that screwed the M16 early in its service life, and that was a change in powder. So the US military in 1925 adopted IMR, improved military rifle powder, and they didn't change the velocity or the bullet weight or really anything about the cartridge. If you just looked at a 30-06 cartridge, like when the bullet came out the barrel, it was completely indistinguishable. But because it was using a new powder, the pressure curve changed. And the whole purpose of IMR was it was a slower burning powder, and it kind of progressively accelerated the bullet, where the previous powder had burned faster. It accelerated the bullet very quickly at first and then kind of tapered off. Garand had designed this system around the pressure curve of that early ammunition, because that's what existed when he built the rifle. The new IMR ammunition didn't reliably cycle this thing and would have required a fairly substantial redesign of all those closely calculated parts. At the same time, the US military also instituted this new policy of staking primers in place. Like, you'd put the primer into the cartridge case, and then they would actually put 3 little crimps around the outside of the primer pocket to guarantee that the primer didn't come loose. And that was a good thing for the machine gun ammunition, and it was the death knell for this rifle, because this has to have the primer move. And you know the military is not going to be willing to adopt 2 different versions of the same cartridge, where if you accidentally switch them up, the machine gun ammunition just flat out will not work in the rifle. There's no way that's going to get adopted. So when those 2 changes happened, this rifle was gone, dead, had absolutely no chance left. And that left Garand in a position of having to redesign the rifle. And as a result, we would end up with the M1 Garand that we have today, with a long stroke gas piston under the barrel and a 2-lug rotating bolt. So to put a little bit more of this in context, I know a lot of people are going to be curious about John Pedersen. John Pedersen was just coming into the picture when this rifle happened. So Pedersen first spoke to Congress in 1923 about the issues involved in a self-loading rifle, and Pedersen was kind of a rock star of a gun designer. At that time, John Garand was nobody. He was just some guy working for the government who had this idea for a rifle. Pedersen had a bunch of successful designs. He had commercial designs. He designed the Pedersen device, which had been made in mass quantities for World War I, although never used because the war ended. He approached Congress and said, basically, hey, you guys should give me some money and I'll develop an autoloading rifle and it'll be the greatest one ever, and problem will be solved. And Congress kind of looked at him with these big doe eyes and went, wow, you do that? Okay. And they gave him a bunch of money, and the result was he started developing the Pedersen self-loading rifle, the toggle action rifle that a lot of you will be familiar with. That is the rifle that would eventually compete against the new version of John Garand's rifle. So we do actually also have a video on the .276 caliber, the T3E2, one of the early trials new pattern Garand rifles. So if you're interested in following the development of this story, definitely check that video out. If you would like to see more pictures and Rock Island's detailed description, pictures, value estimate, and everything else for this rifle, which is going to be really close to a one-of-a-kind piece. There might be another one of these floating around, but I don't think there's more than that. So if you'd like to see Rock Island stuff on it, take a look at the description text below. You'll find a link there to my site, ForgottenWeapons.com, and from there you can link over to Rock Island's catalog page and check out all the information that they have on it. Thank you very much for watching.